Since making my last few videos on the gammas, log, and subsampling for Sony cameras, I've received an impressive amount of questions from you guys wanting additional information and advice. So today we're going to try and cover as many of those as possible. Let's get undone. Gerald Undone. He's crazy. What's happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and I've not yeed my last haw yet. Alright, so here's how we're going to do this. I'm going to list all the questions we're going to cover and provide timestamps in case you want to jump around, and as usual, I'll put a table of contents in the description. And because we'll be covering a bunch of topics, we're not going to be able to go too far in depth with any of them to prevent bloating the video too much. And I'm also going to try and keep these concepts accessible enough that even non-Sony users will find some value here as well. And speaking to you non-Sony users, don't worry, I know with this recent string of videos, I'm not becoming a Sony-only channel. We're going to get back to our regular antics right after this video. Oh yeah, and I'm just getting over bronchitis, so if I sound like I've been eating sandpaper, that's why. So here are the questions. Was this video shot using HLG? Do you use any LUTs? What did you do for white balance? Is an HLG for HDR only and thus shouldn't be graded? Why shoot in BT 2020 if you're just going to convert it? And how do you convert BT 2020 to Rec 709? Have you tried Pro Color or Cody Blue settings? What did you mean by neutral picture profile settings? How do you match the different profiles? And can you provide some grading tips? Alright, so let's start working through these. Was this video shot with HLG? Now this question was obviously asked about one of the previous videos, but to keep it simple, all the previous videos are shot using the same setup. So unless otherwise stated, like when I provide different samples, this talking head is almost always recorded on a Panasonic GH5 using 10-bit HLG and recorded onto the Atomos Ninja 5. I grade that footage in Premiere and I start by using a technical LUT from Paul Leeming, which goes to answer our second question. Yes, I do use LUTs for corrective purposes, but I'm not a big fan of creative or artistic LUTs. I like to do the creative portion of the grade myself, but it helps when someone who has the tools and experience gets you started in the right direction and with accurate color. And for that purpose, I highly recommend the Leeming LUTs. Now, this video is not sponsored in any way, and I don't make any money off the sale of these LUTs, but they've worked really well for me, and so if you want to give them a try yourself, I'll put a link in the description below. He supports a lot of different cameras, including the Cine, HLG, and S-Log for the Sony cameras. But we'll talk more about dealing with that HLG clip in Premiere in a moment. Next up, white balance. Whenever I do testing and comparisons, I almost always set a custom white balance off of a gray card. Now, I made a whole video about this, which I recommend you check out if you haven't yet, but basically it keeps your shots more consistent for the testing purposes, and this talking head shot on the GH5 right now was also set with a custom white balance using this gray card. Next question, which is about misconceptions for HLG. So yes, HLG is intended for delivery in HDR, and when kept in the 2020 space, it's true that it doesn't grade as well as you might expect a true log profile to. But when used in a 709 timeline, those concerns are no longer relevant, and what you're left with is excellent dynamic range, a clean image, and terrific color potential. And for those of you that don't know much about 2020 or 709, basically there's standards for how to display an image on television. It's the ITUR recommendation BT 2020 or BT 709, which is usually shortened to REC as in REC 709 or BT as in BT 2020. These recommendations cover many aspects, including frame rate, bit depth, and luma representations. But an easier way to visualize it is by the wider chromaticity. BT 2020 allows for more colors and brighter ones. Which brings us to the next question that I get asked a lot, which is why shoot in 2020 if you're just going to convert to 709? With many Sony users adding that choosing 709 as the color mode for HLG makes for a better looking image. And they're not wrong. Right out of the camera, the 709 will look better, and that's kind of the point. Unless you have a 2020 display, the 709 content will look better because it's intended for the 709 display you're viewing it on. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't shoot in 2020. First of all, shooting in 2020 will give you better matching capabilities. It'll match all the other cameras that choose 2020 automatically when using HLG or that don't have a built-in 709 conversion, which is why most of the correction LUTs are based on 2020. And so if you want to use a LUT to make your life easier, like the Leeming LUT I recommended, you'll have to shoot in 2020 or the LUT's not going to work. Also, you'll retain full color information even if you can't see it on your display, so that when we bring it down to 709, you'll have a better range to work with. And you'll be retaining that HDR content, so if ever you wanted to use that clip again in the future for HDR delivery, it'll still be useful, where 709 clip wouldn't be. And this is where a lot of you asked how to convert from 2020 to 709, and of course this depends on your NLE. In Premiere Pro it's essentially automatic because Lumetri works in a Rec 709 color space and converts for linear processing, which is just another reason why the concern about the non-linear response when grading HLG is nothing to worry about, because it's treated as linear and grades beautifully when using a linear 709 tool. Now you will find that the image looks flat and green when viewing the HLG in 709, but this is completely normal. It's here where you'd want to work with the curves to get the image to look how you'd want. But again, if you're using a correction LUT, you can just skip these steps. So here's some GH5 HLG footage completely untouched. All I did was drop it into my timeline, which is automatically Rec 709 in Premiere. And if we open this up in Lumetri and choose to add the Leeming LUT for HLG for the GH5, The battle's mostly won. And then we can just move down and tweak the image to taste. This is the same for Final Cut Pro in terms of the LUT. Simply applying the leaming LUT will correct your HLG footage, but there is an extra step with regard to color space. First off, you want to make sure that your project is set to the standard gamut, but even then your clips will look blown out. So you have to go down to the inspector and choose Basics and then Settings and then choose Rec 709 in the color space override. And then your clips will look flat and green like I showed you in Premiere. Now, I don't have Final Cut because I'm a PC editor, so I can't really show you a proper demo, but I will put a link to a guide in the description below that will show you how to do this step by step. And it will also show you how to add a LUT from this stage. In Resolve, if you want to work with HLG natively, you'll have to go into the project settings, color management section, and change the input and timeline color space to Rec 2020 HLG, and then change the output color space to Rec 709 HLG. But if you plan on using a correction LUT, then you can skip this step, because a great thing about the leaming LUT is that it will still correct your footage even if your project isn't color managed. Okay, so for the next question, which is more specific to Sony, let's talk about some of those picture profiles that are recommended online. First off, the EOSHD Pro Color ones. Now, I don't want to sit here and bash someone else's work because I know there's a lot of you that like those Pro Color profiles, but generally I would advise against paying for picture profiles because you're literally just buying numbers, and in my opinion, numbers that don't create a very accurate or flexible image. It's also why I don't recommend buying creative or artistic LUTs. They just don't work reliably unless you're shooting similar things under similar conditions. And often those looks can be pretty easy to recreate with just a little bit of practice and knowledge with your color panel. In fact, I think calling them LUTs is a bit of a misnomer. They're really just glorified presets. But at least artistic LUTs are non-destructive though. You can always turn them off. But if you change your picture profile with some wacky settings, well then your footage is going to be captured like that, and you're drastically going to reduce your ability to use technical LUTs or even match to another shooter's camera. But let's take a look at what I mean by establishing a baseline image. So this shot here is done with Cine 2 on the Sony a7 III using Cinema Color and all other settings left at their defaults except for detail, which is set to -7. Actually, let's take a minute here to answer that question about the neutral settings for picture profiles. Some of you were concerned that if you reprogram a picture profile that you used before that you would lose track of the neutral settings, or that if you hit the reset button that it would produce a different result, but in either case, these are the default neutral settings that I was referring to. But I would set every profile to -7 detail, even though that's not a default setting, because in-camera sharpening is terrible. Always do it in post. Alright, so back to this shot. This is the recommended profile for easiest shooting and editing. The other Cines are good too, but they capture levels outside of delivery range because the highlights can go all the way up to 109%, but Cine 2 can't do that. It's capped out at 100%, so it's the easiest to grade of the flat profiles. It's also the friendliest to the Sony's limited bit depth of 8-bit. Each step we make toward an improved gamma with better dynamic range reduces our flexibility in post because of the bit depth limitations of Sony mirrorless cameras. And this is why the Cine gammas are great. HLG is good too, and that's as high as I would go. I would avoid S-Log. S-Log 2 can be good in ideal conditions, but S-Log 3 is a non-starter in my opinion. Now you will get people telling you that one Cine gamma will have better dynamic range or perform better in low light than another one, but in my experience this doesn't read true. Sony has all 4 Cines listed as the same dynamic range on their website, but there are different exposure requirements in order to achieve that. So it's possible that people don't really know how to expose them and then they're complaining about the dynamic range differences, but if you expose them all correctly and then bring them to the same levels in post, I bet that you will fail the Pepsi challenge as to which is which. Then that statement is more pointed towards Cine 1 versus Cine 2, because Cine 3 and 4 do have more contrast, but if you correct for that contrast in post as well, they will all look almost identical. And I'll show you how to match these Cine profiles when we get to that question a little bit later on. Now, if you know how to read a waveform and are okay with adjusting your output levels in post, then Cine 1 might be the best of the lot because of that wider starting position, which might allow you to hide more noise when you lower the black level, and will have brighter highlights which can be appreciated on some screens without having to deal with the extra contrast of Cine 3 and Cine 4. But again, this difference is minor, as in less than 5%, and if you don't want to mess with any of that, Cine 2 is still a great option. Now when it comes to Cine, some people like to use Pro Color here instead of Cinema Color to make it even more deliverable right out of camera. But I prefer to adjust the saturation and colors in post and find Pro to be a bit too much for my taste, and it can sometimes cause these weird color flares that don't blend as nicely, which you can see around the lights in this example here, despite everything else being exactly the same. Okay, so for grading this clip, we can either put on the leaming LUT for Cine 2 at this point, or we can do a quick grade ourselves, and we get a baseline image that fairly represents what I and my space look like. Now I should probably mention that the grade that I put on this clip, as well as the one that I use on the GH5, has a little bit of extra purple in the shadows and a bit of a cream color in the highlights. It doesn't change the mid-range color accuracy too much, but it's just something to be aware of moving forward. But here it is before and after, so you can get a sense of it. And as for that grading tips question, while we're at it, let's just go ahead and match all the other Cine profiles as well, all with Cinema Color, with the rest of their settings set to those neutral defaults except for the detail, which is set to -7. So Cine 2 and Cine 1 are easy. They grade pretty much the same. As you can see, the settings are identical on the side and the images look pretty much exactly the same as well. Now Cine 3 and Cine 4 is when you're going to jump into that extra contrast that we were talking about, but as you can see I was able to match it pretty closely to Cine 2 and Cine 1, and to do that we just take the contrast down to about -45 and take a couple points off of saturation. We have it down to 98, and that's pretty much it. Now Cine 4 is a little bit harder. If we jump over here we can see how it's much more contrasty, and there's a bit of a temperature change as well. But we were able to get it to match pretty closely. We dropped the contrast down to -45 again. There was also a bit of a temperature change, like I said. We had to warm it up a little bit and take a little bit of the magenta out of it. And then I bumped the highlights a little bit because when you take so much contrast out of something, often the skin gets a little bit flatter looking. So I added a little bit to the highlights and a little bit to the shadows. And overall, it doesn't look it's not as easy as Cine 3 because of how far they push Cine 4, but you can get it pretty close. So here's Cine 4, Cine 3, Cine 2, and Cine 1. Now the differences that I showed you on Cine 3 and Cine 4 were in addition to whatever changes you make to make Cine 2 or Cine 1 look the way that you want. So I actually have two different grades going on here. The top one is what I did to grade Cine 2, and then the bottom one is just the differences there of lowering the contrast. So the top layer looks exactly like the settings do here for Cine 1 and Cine 2. Now let's take a look at some HLG clips. I used the leaming LUT for these because I didn't want to go through and monkey with all the curves, but if you want to do that, you're going to want to start with pulling the green out and working your way through from there. But if you're striving for accuracy without a color checker, this is going to be hard work. It's fine if you want to do something artistic, but if you're doing this for commercial clients, it might not fly. And this is where a good LUT will save you time and make your work more consistent. Now the leaming LUT was designed for the base HLG gamma, so if you want to use HLG3, which is definitely superior, you're going to have to tweak it a bit. When comparing my slider differences between HLG and HLG3 using the leaming LUT, I found that I had to pull the saturation down quite a bit more for HLG3, and I also didn't have to bring the highlights down as far, but other than that, it wasn't that much different. Now HLG 1 and 2 are sometimes recommended because they have improved noise reduction due to having a lower ceiling for max output at 87 and 95% respectively. So they're trading off dynamic range to reduce noise by pushing down the signal and noise simultaneously. But similar to what I said about the Cines, when you take the HLGs and expose them correctly and then bring them to the same levels in post, it becomes very difficult to detect the differences unless you zoom in. I will acknowledge, however, that even when corrected in post, HLG 1 does have less noisy blacks than HLG 2 and 3. It is minor though and might not be worth the loss of dynamic range, so I would probably stick with HLG 3 unless I was shooting primarily shadows. HLG 1 and 2 also grade identically to HLG 3, so it's harmless to switch between them as long as you factor in the lower max highlight range. Now if we compare these HLG shots to our Cine grades from earlier, we have them all looking pretty similar. Okay, so now let's jump back to those profiles you asked about from EOSHD and Cody Blue now that we have something to compare them to. First up we have Pro Color version 4, and this one is just a mess when it comes to matching our previous looks. Now I'm not going to provide you these settings because that wouldn't be fair to the creator who's selling them, but I can tell you that it relies heavily on bumping the saturation a lot and tweaking each individual component of the color depth section. And as I was saying earlier, this means we've destructively altered our color to no longer match other Sony cameras, and using LUTs isn't going to save us. Now this doesn't mean that the creator intended to make bad settings or is colorblind, but rather that these settings are tuned for the conditions in which that creator shoots. And as I've already said, this is a recurring problem with creative LUTs and profiles. If you have different lighting, white balancing, or colors in your shot, these types of settings will often do more harm than good. There's a review for these profiles that I think says this best. This customer first laid out how bad of an experience they were having with Pro Color version 4 in most scenarios, but then followed up by saying, "Last week we went to Slovenia for a small road trip, so I took my A7 III and used EOSHD Pro Color version 4 HDR for all footage. In the end, I was very surprised how good the image looks after a little bit of color correction. So my conclusion is this profile is great for travel videos and for jobs where you don't have to be color accurate." And I think that's a reasonable expectation to have when using settings like this, but it's also the reason why I don't recommend them. Now they mentioned the HDR profile, and I tested that one too, and it looks like this. Now this one's a little bit better in my opinion than the previous version, but it still suffers from plastic skin and the same inaccurate colors. It's definitely not suited for this kind of indoor, moody shooting environment. Now let's try the Cine 4 settings from Cody Blue. This profile isn't too bad at all, but it does have some issues. First off, the recommendation to set the knee to 80% is going to crowd that highlight range for people with really light skin like me. knee. This will give the skin a slightly worse texture and remove some of the subtle gradations. This one also features a custom color depth, which, as I've said numerous times, is a mistake because it reduces your camera's compatibility with LUTs and other cameras. And changing the color is easy to do in post, and you can take your time with it and get it right with more precise tools. And to prove this, I'll show you how I matched the Cody blue to our previous Cine 4 vanilla settings from earlier, so you can see what's different about it and also how to fix it. Overall though, despite my complaints of how we got there, I do think that this image looks pretty good. If we turn on the effects here, we can see how I got it to match the other ones because the reds are going a little bit wild here. That was obviously a stylistic choice, likes to boost the reds, but in order to get those to match, I just went down to the HSL here and bumped up the reds a little bit more purpley, and that brought them closer to the correct color of my shirt. And then in order to get to match the Cine 4 a little bit closer, I had to take the contrast down by about 10, lower the saturation by a notch, and I made the whole image a little bit more green. And then collectively, it looks pretty close to our previous Cine 4 now. And if we take it off, we go back to the Cody blue look. Cody blue also has an HLG3 profile, but it's in BT 2020, so the similar instructions from earlier apply. Other than that, he doesn't really change much except for the black level and the knee. This is definitely the wrong knee for HLG, and I'm not a big fan of raising the black level. Most of the time, people raise the black level to give it a pseudo-cinema filmic look, but it's something that's better left to post so you don't contaminate your blacks when you're recording. The only time to touch your black level, in my opinion, is if you're trying to deliver noise-free content straight out of camera in a low-light environment. Which brings us to our last asked about profile, the low-light profile from Josh Yo. Overall though, the Cody blue profiles are pretty good, and best of all, he doesn't charge for them, he's just sharing a look that he likes. So Josh Yo recommends this profile for low-light shooting using the still gamma and pro color with a lowered black level and reduced saturation. And this all makes sense. You're going to maximize the contrast on what's important and push out the noise and dirty shadows that aren't. The reduced saturation is to fight off the intensity of pro color while keeping the shot deliverable right out of camera. It's a logical configuration that produces pretty clean results. The only con is it's fairly limited in its use. If you don't have high contrast details to work with that you really want to separate from the background, this profile won't really give you much to work with because it has significantly reduced dynamic range, but it is good at what Josh Yo intended it for. But again, you can accomplish this in post by pushing down the blacks and upping the contrast on an unmodified Cine profile. Here's that Cine 2 clip with the contrast up to 60 and the blacks set to -10. And if we zoom in on a shadow, I would suggest that it's actually cleaner in terms of noise than the low light profile. And I think that's where most people get confused with these low light profiles that are circling around. Reducing dynamic range and hammering the blacks into the ground can be accomplished on any profile in post. And it's naive to think that one set of settings will somehow unlock this magic sauce that doesn't have to adhere to the science of signal to noise ratio. But if your goal is to find a profile that will squash some noise when delivering right out of the camera, then Josh Yo's settings will work for you. And it looks pretty good too. Anyway, I think that's it for all the questions. As I said in a previous video, I know that it's tempting to try and find some magic combination of settings that's just going to make all your shots look great, but that's just not how it works. Every time you change environments or subjects, you're going to have to reevaluate how you want to tackle the look of your project. Tricks and gimmicks are not the answer, and that includes magic picture profiles. It's always going to come down to practice and patience. But that's going to be it for me. I hope you found this video helpful or at least entertaining, and if you did, make sure you leave it the old thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. But if you did not find this video helpful or entertaining, feel free to hit the dislike button twice. Alright, I'm done.